Having Christine tonight was in response to a survey that we did back in the days when we still met. There were several people that asked for this topic, and I am so pleased that we were able to get Christine to talk with us tonight. Christine Povinelli has a PhD in molecular biology and genetics. She has immersed herself in nature and gardening for food and habitat for humans and the other creatures we share the planet with for most of her life. Sitting in a tree when she was young, she had a sense of an opening that she has held on to this day. So she states she didn't so much educate herself, but kept herself open to the teachings of the simultaneous complexities and simplicities of our natural world. She believes that re-equilibrating ourselves with the other living entities we share the planet with is essential for our survival. The lesson from watching 3 generations of gardeners and her family is that we don't so much actually grow food and other plants. We provide a healthy habitat and water, and the plants grow themselves. Plants know what they are doing and how to do it. They don't need us. We are not involved in the daily process of creation, but we can experience these things as gifts from nature. She had a small lot next to her house, and her children helped her to add native and food plants. It became strikingly obvious to her and her neighbors that there was a cloud of birds and insects covering that lot, a sight seen nowhere else in the neighborhood of non-native and non-changing landscapes. The lesson? It doesn't take much to make a big difference. Please welcome Christine Povinelli. I know you will enjoy this.
Thank you for having me here to talk. I gave a version of this talk a few months ago for the Houston chapter, and it's online, but I've been involved in helping a group put a pond in, so I'm kind of emphasizing different things in this talk. So we'll get started. So the scope of this talk is really about just how you put ponds in, how you put these ponds in, 2 different basic types of these simple habitat ponds, the basic, methods of simple things to do to put them in, and then how you just set up conditions for a biologically self-balancing system to evolve. And then a little bit about maintenance, which there isn't much, and pitfalls to avoid. The main reason, though, and the main thing is about the joy that these ponds can bring. I can't really show you or have you experience that in this talk, but that's the main thing about putting a pond in is to be able to more fully experience joy in your garden and watch the joy of the creatures who use it. Okay, so the first thing I'm going to talk about is the difference between what I'm calling koi ponds and habitat ponds. And there's nothing wrong with koi ponds. I'm kind of going to be picking on them a little bit, but it's just to illustrate the difference. So koi ponds are designed really to look at the koi. And so they want them to be kind of clear, unobstructed viewing. And but because people want a lot of koi and they're large fish, they're kind of always in a delicate balance between overwhelming the system in the pond. And that's really why you need all the filtration methods and the pumps and filters and monitoring carefully the balance of the nice things going on in the water. Because koi are so big and eat a lot of other creatures that are in the pond, like smaller tadpoles and things, you have a relatively low species diversity and it more mimics a fish tank. Habitat ponds are designed for to have variable amounts of water levels by having sloped access around the edges, so that if the level of water goes up and down a little bit, it's not going to affect the ability of creatures that use the pond to get in and out. There's no need for water piping or electricity with these ponds. You don't have filters. You don't have to worry about anything breaking because they're set up so that they naturally self-balance. They support a diverse environment for a diverse variety of wildlife in and around the pond. And often people think, oh, well, I want to see a big thing in the pond so that I can enjoy it, like a big fish or a turtle or something. But if you make one of these ponds and you sit down near the edge of the water, low to the ground, and just sit and watch all the creatures that come by, it's a remarkable experience of connecting with these little creatures like dragonflies and bees and wasps and the lizards that are hunting near the edge of the pond. And you're just right on eye level, and you start to notice more small details and more of a variety of details. And you just can relate to these creatures and see their intelligence and their diligence, and they're just doing what they do. And you can form relationships with some of them. You feel that they will recognize you if you're there regularly. And so I think it gives you more of a feeling of connectedness, just like gardening with plants, and which you will be. And when we feel more connected to our gardens, with the creatures that are there, with the plants, with the food plants, we value nature more. And when people come and visit and experience that in our yards or gardens, then they value those kind of things more. And I think it becomes clear why it's important for us to make space for all these creatures. So you might say, how can it be so simple? Everyone I've talked to, if I go to a pond store, they want to sell me, they say I need a filter and a pump and lay electrical wires and water pipes. Well, that's really not true if you make one of these ponds, because if you think about it, there's ponds all over the world, in the woods. Nobody maintains them. So these ponds as in nature, just let sun and natural systems provide, and species diversity and various microhabitats provide a self-balancing system. And we can learn about that system, we can know about aspects of it, and that's very exciting to know, but we actually don't need to know anything about the details of it. It will do it itself. And again, koi ponds are great. I love to look at koi, but they involve, more energy, more worry about if the conditions are staying right. These just provide an alternative, easier method, easier way, and actually provide a lot more environmental benefit. So one of the first things that people worry about with standing water, because we don't have pumps and filters and things, is about mosquitoes. And in these ponds, I put some gambusia, which is like a minnow mosquito fish. They keep the pond free of mosquito larvae. They live bear, so if you put like 5 or 7 of them in your pond to start with, you'll get a stable population. I've had a pond for like 20 years, and I only put these fish in there once, and they never died out, and the pond has never had mosquitoes. No pond has had mosquitoes that has these. The other thing that will keep your pond from having mosquitoes are dragonfly larvae, or dragonflies, and their larvae at the bottom of the screen. These are some little baby larvae that we took out of a pond we had I had early on. They live underwater, and if you watch them, they suck mosquito larvae up like spaghetti. And they're voracious predators of all kinds of little creatures in the pond, and they're part of the self-balancing system. And dragonflies will come on their own to your pond and lay their eggs, and you'll have these, which is a backup to the mosquito fish. And dragonflies are amazing creatures. They need these ponds in order to reproduce. My understanding is that dragonflies that hatch from one body of water need to go to a different body of water to reproduce. I think it's a way of maintaining genetic diversity. These are amazing creatures, and they're one of the greatest delights of having one of these kind of ponds. I had a bigger pond installation one time I put in. I was amazed to see how many dragonflies came, and I noticed that they seemed to come in waves. Like, I don't remember the order, but like blue ones followed, overlapping and followed by yellow ones, and then overlapping and followed by the green ones, varieties, and then red ones, like a rainbow of dragonflies from the spring through the summer. Kind of was the reference in the first slide with the rainbow. Just remarkably intelligent and interesting creatures. Okay, so I'm going to go through, so some of these slides were in the last talk I gave, which is on Facebook, but I'm going to give more of a case study in this one. So some slides I'll go through quicker, but there's two basic approaches you can use. Basically putting in one of these ponds involves digging a hole and putting an impermeable, water impermeable layer, and then adding some rocks and pavers, some native plants and gambusia, and you're done, and dirt, you're done. But there's two basic approaches. One is with a flexible liner, and I'll give some sources, some online sources you can read about, but the EPDM is probably the best, although there's different considerations for different situations. And there on these online, you can see how to calculate, given the size of your hole, how much square footage of the flexible liner you'll need, which is indicated. I kind of have a little calculation there, but it's on the online resources. Or you can buy one of these preformed shaped pond forms. You don't want to use other types of containers. I'm not saying nothing else would work, but like some people have asked me, can I use just put a tin, like one of those cow watering, what do you call it, tank tins things on top of the ground full of water. Well, those things get really hot and will kill everything in your pond. And if you bury them, they might rust, I'm not sure. So you really want to go with things that is designed for ponds. So basically you decide which way you want to go, and then you dig a hole and you put an underlayer of sand or old carpet or newspapers or, to kind of protect the liner, especially the flexible liner. And so you should be able to put a small to medium-sized pond in for a cost of around $100 to $600, and I'll go through. The advantage of a flexible liner is that you can shape it more easily different ways, and I'll illustrate that also. So just as an overview, this is what you're wanting to think about when you're putting the pond in, when you're digging, if you're digging a hole and using a flexible liner, for example, this heavy black line would be the flexible liner. This is another layer of leftover or spare liner that you might put on top of it along the edges, so that when you lay rocks or plant pots on the edge, it helps protect the main liner. Under the liner is where you would put sand or some other material to protect the main liner from any rocks or sticks that might be in the dirt. On top of the liner, after you've dug it out, you want to put some dirt back in the pond, like I would say about 2 to 3 inches of dirt. And you can throw some leaves in there. That's going to help form microhabitats for microscopic creatures, worms, and other little things that live in there that help balance the pond. As you can see, you want to have some way of having a slope with, here it's illustrated by rocks So that if you have your expected water level, if the water level drops because maybe it hasn't rained for a long time or you're going away, there's still sloped areas where little creatures like baby toads or dragonfly larvae can crawl up out of the pond when they need to, or adult toads even. Sometimes you'll see people who put in ponds or koi ponds and they have straight vertical edges. And if like adult toads will jump in there to mate and lay eggs, and then they can't get out, they will drown. So it's really important in these kind of ponds to have these graduated sloped edges. The other thing you want to do is make sure that when you dig the hole, that all sides of the pond are level, because if the highest part of your pond is at this height on one side and it's down over here on the other side, then when you fill it up, it will only fill up this tall and you'll have a lot of exposed liner. So you want to make sure it's level. You can put flat rocks or pavers and kind of have them overhang slightly and rest on some of these other rocks that you have in the pond to kind of hide the edge of the liner. But you want to make sure that that's stable and doesn't overhang too much so that people don't step on the edge and flip into the pond. You want to think about city fencing requirements if you have a pond, and pre-existing buried piping or wiring you should investigate before you put a pond in. So I'm going to spend some time talking about an example that I was helping advise on just recently at Festival Beach Community Garden in Austin, Texas. The Habitat Committee approached me and they wanted to put in a habitat pond. It's a large community garden, a very active community garden, and they're also very aware of the importance of providing native habitat for insects and bees, which are of course important for our food supply. We initially started thinking about this some point after COVID started, and because it might be simpler, we had thought about putting in using just a preformed liner. And so we came up with the estimated cost. The garden members would be doing the labor. The pond form, about a 4.5 by 6 or 7 foot pond form would be about $200. We could put an underlayer of play sand in, water plants. Some I could share from an existing pond I have, and we might buy a few. Some minnows I was planning on sharing from my pond, and rocks and cement pavers around $100. They also had some rocks on site. So for around $500, they we came up with a budget and they raised the money, but we couldn't get the pond liner, the preformed pond form, because the supplies were not available because of the pandemic. So we decided to switch over and do use a flexible liner. And this shows graphically the hole that was dug for the pond. Several of the members, in small groups, over a little time, dug a hole about 3 feet deep. You want it at least around 3 feet deep so that the final depth is at least 2.5 feet. So the fish have some place to go. If it gets really cold, they can go deep. And also, if they need to stay cool, they can also go deeper in the pond. In Houston, I'm used to gumbo soil. We're used to gumbo soil, which is clay. In Austin, they have strange soil I'm not familiar with. You can see there's a pickaxe here. They actually have to first break it apart with a pickaxe and then shovel it out. But it goes fairly quickly. So first they dug the main deep part of the hole. And then they dug a ledge about a foot and a half wide, or a foot wide and a foot deep. And this ledge will be where the rocks will be piled to form that graduated entrance and exit to the pond for small creatures. Also, you can put pots of plants on this ledge, so it's easier to get to them and maintain them. The pond installations are very flexible. There's no exact detail. We were going to collect newspaper to put around the edges, but everything's more difficult nowadays. So we decided to use, we couldn't do that. So we decided to use old paper grocery bags. And this is part of the process, just getting wet and laying along the ledges, because this is going to be where most of the weight is from the rocks we'll have sitting on the liner and pots. So you want to kind of just insulate the liner from anything sharp in the dirt. As far as the siting of this pond, people ask, oh, can you do it near a tree? You can see in the back here, this is oak tree, I believe. And it's maybe it's 10 to 8 feet or maybe 10 feet, I'm not really sure, but something like that, from the pond. And they didn't run into any roots. And you can see there's a lot of leaves here, and leaves will fall in the pond, and that's okay. I'll talk about that later. So we ended up putting bags carefully around all the edge of the pond. We put some sand in the bottom, and we used some of the oak leaves too as kind of a buffer layer instead of newspaper. This is the liner. It should have also cost around $200. I don't know if the Kindly pond store in Austin, maybe they heard this was for a community garden, but they got this liner for about $12, and it was huge. These liners are pretty heavy. And so on the left, it's shown not fully unfolded. We were just starting to unfold it. And when we saw how much liner there was, we laid it in the pond that we had dug, and we saw we had so much liner that they decided they wanted to expand the pond the day we put the liner in. And so again, with the pickaxe and shovels, they dug out a whole nother large section that was about a foot and a half deep, which would be just a shallow end that we could kind of almost like a water garden addition. And you can see here where this tree is in relation to the pond. And on the other sides of the pond, it's pretty open, but there are some trees, but it gets a good amount of sun. So here, this is showing about laying the line, spreading the liner out, and it's not going to ever be perfectly smooth because of the shape of the hole, the shapes of the hole. But you want to just kind of arrange the folds as best as you can, kind of flat. And you also don't want it to be too tight from the top to the bottom, because when you start putting water in the pond, you don't want the weight of the water pulling down on the liner and stretching it where it might, if it's impacting on something, it might break. So you want to leave it kind of loose from the top to the bottom a little bit, and just kind of arrange these folds as best as possible. And this is illustrating this section that they dug out at the last minute. So that is one advantage of the liner. You can kind of shape the hole or the shape of your pond very flexibly and alter it while you're in progress. Now, whenever you're putting these ponds in, you might think, oh gosh, should I do it this way? Should I do it that way? And you're going to forget something, but the process itself is very flexible, and there's not just one way to do it. We had the liner kind of in, and I thought, oh my gosh, we forgot to check, did we have all the edges level? Although it had looked pretty level. So we just found an old 2x4 and a bubble level, and it was pretty good. And you can also adjust the levels after you fill it with water you can kind of see if one side's higher or not, adjust the dirt under the liner, either removing it or adding it. So even if you're putting these ponds in and you forgot something, or you think, oh, I'm not doing it the exact same way, there's just a lot of different ways to do it. For underlayers under the pond, I mean, you can use almost anything, right? Newspapers, you could use probably weed barrier, a couple layers of weed barrier, probably old shower curtains, you know. There's just a lot of different ways materials you can use. So this shows a picture of the pond once the liner's all in. We also used extra liner, which is a good idea, to put on these shells and kind of overlapping, because there's going to be rocks on here eventually. And here's some extra, and we also put an extra layer on this larger shallow area they dug, and also on the bottom here. So anywhere we thought there might be some extra pressure on the liner, we put leftover pieces of liner. These red arrows are indicating that when you make the shelves, if you slope them so that their edge of the shelf closest to the deep part is a little higher than the part of the shelf closest to the outer edge, you'll get a slope, kind of like a slope, so that when you put rocks on there, they won't slide into the pond. They'll want them to slide back toward the wall. So just shaping that ledge a little bit with that slope is also a good idea. Okay, and you can hold the liner in place with rocks temporarily as you're putting it into. This shows us putting throwing dirt and leaves just from the site into the bottom of the pond before we fill it with water. So in that, on the left here, there's this shallow area that they dug out. It kind of, I think it extends partly like from around there, around here. We decided to, and you can see we've already started filling it with water. We made an area to plant pickerel weed, and kind of decided to make a little barrier so that you could better control the extent of the growth of the pickerel weed. And we did that by putting just some rocks they had on site to make a wall. And then on the inside of the wall, and then we're going to fill this with dirt. And we had a few pots of pickerel weed that are dormant right now, but that will eventually grow out of the pots into this whole area. But in order to keep the dirt from coming out of those cracks between the rocks, we used the oak leaves that were on site to form a thick barrier between the rocks, the inner edge of the rocks, and the dirt we were adding as we were adding the dirt. And when the pickerel weed starts to grow out of the pots and into this area, the roots will hold the dirt in place as the leaves decay. And so this red line is just showing roughly the extent of this shallower area. And this all is going to be submerged by water when the pond is full. Right now, they placed some pots of plants that are mostly dormant. So this is not going to be a beautiful looking pond in these pictures. You can see the ledge here. They just started placing some pots of native plants. I'll tell you what, I'll go over which kind. This is Louisiana iris and lizard tail, but I have a list I'll go over. But here's a ledge here, starting to put rocks on it and some pots. And you can see the pots of pickerel weed there, but they'll grow out. And so this is a view when it's almost pretty full of with water. And you can see this is the shallow area down here. And this is that wall. And there's dirt in there with the pickerel weed. We planted the irises in a pot. Even now, they might decide to make another dirt area and just plant the irises directly in that. It's pretty flexible. This is just a temporary arrangement of rocks to hold the liner in place. I believe this weekend they're starting to bring in the rest of some other rocks to create a kind of a approach on this side for people with flat rocks and get a better arrangement of rocks here. Also, this was situated so that this back area of the pond is not a place that people generally walk or go. And we'll be adding, it has some native plants, and we'll be adding some more native plants. And it's a good idea when you design a pond like this to have, if you can, half of it or so with a habitat area where people aren't going to be tromping and walking, because it gives an undisturbed location for various creatures to live and approach the pond. Oh, and so we filled the pond with water. The pond is filled with water. We put some just dechlorinator in there like you would use in a fish tank. The last time I gave this talk, I said you can just put the water in there and let it sit for a couple days with the plants and then add the minnows after the chlorine is dissipated. And someone asked me about chloramines, and that now they're putting chloramines in the water, and that doesn't dissipate in the sun as quickly. And I'd never even heard of that, so I don't know. So with this pond, we put, but I looked it up and I guess that's true, although I've never had an issue with it. We just added dechlorinator to this just to be sure. And so then I had brought some little bits of plants, native plants from the pond I have at my house to add to some of the plants they had. This is full of water, ready to add fish. And this is just a different view showing that dirt area where we put the pickerel weed is going to grow is completely submerged with water. So fish will be able to kind of swim all around here. This is the kind of the extent of that flat, shallower area. They've started to infill with some rocks here for free creatures to get in and out. They'll continue to do that around these edges here. So this is just about adding the minnows. You want to let the pond sit for it's good to let the pond sit for a few days before you add the minnows. And when you can get minnows, like probably at any body of water, natural water around. Also, pond stores have minnows, have these gambusia you can buy. And when you first put them in the pond, they might disappear. And you might think they died, but sometimes they just get scared and go to the bottom of the pond for about 10 days, and then they'll come up. If you don't see dead fish bodies, they're probably still alive. Now, except for these gambusia or minnows, you should not add any creatures to the pond. Any creatures that use the pond, that these ponds are designed for, will come to them naturally. If people say, well, can I get a turtle and put a turtle in my little habitat pond? Well, some of these turtles will grow, pretty large for these ponds. Also, turtles want to reproduce. And if you put a turtle in your pond, it's going to have to go look somewhere for another turtle. And so you really won't have a turtle for that long. And also, turtles are big, and if your pond is small, then they start to be a pollution factor in the pond. So you really just want these little minnows, and then whatever other creatures will come. And there will be a lot of activity. You don't need a turtle. This is the pond as it is at the moment. It's just kind of in a holding position as far as the edging and adding. There's places where things can get in and out. We have graduated edging, but they're in the process of getting more rocks. But this is now a fully functional pond, even as it is. I had brought some of this hornwort from my pond to put, and we put that in there. That bag is now the minnows that were just added last week. We went to the fish store when we first got this completed, and the people there were afraid to sell us the fish because they said they would die from the cold and there were no mosquito larvae, mosquitoes reproducing. Then mosquitoes came, so they got some fish, and I think they're going to be fine. I've never had fish die in these ponds. They can go deep, especially having, this is a very important plant to have in the water in the pond. It forms thick mats. It's protection for the baby fish. It probably is insulation for the fish when it gets cold to some extent. And it provides a lot of micro habitat for a variety of tiny microscopic organisms that are vital to the balance of the pond. So in this pond, although it looks kind of like there's nothing there, it's just dormant, but and they didn't get a chance to get started really. But we have pickerel weed, arrowhead, Louisiana iris, horsetail, lizard tail, and hornwort. And so these are pictures of some of those plants. This is pickerel weed. It's a great native plant for bees. It's just, and it's beautiful. This is arrowhead. If you have a smaller pond, the leaves of these are it's kind of similar feel to pickerel weed, but it's an overall smaller plant. That's a good plant for smaller ponds. Pickerel weed can take up some real estate in a pond. This is lizard tail. It can grow on the edge of the pond, or it will grow in shallow water in the pond. It goes dormant. It usually goes dormant in the winter, but it's a perennial. This is horse herb. This just grows as a weed in people's yards. I'll show an example of another pond, a small pond that I put in it where I am now, and I have that growing all around it, and it's beautiful. It's a great evergreen, pretty much, I think evergreen, low ground cover, very neat looking and native. Just to review a little bit, the reason these ponds work is because you create a lot of microhabitats, or you put plants and things in there where the microhabitats create themselves. And the organisms will come in the air, on the rocks, and the dirt, and the pond plants, and they will establish themselves in their own balance. So there's plants on the edge of the pond. You can put little piles of little rocks on the bottom of the pond or on the edges. Different kind of organisms like to grow on the rocks or in between the rocks. Submerged plants, the roots will help filter the water, the nitrogen out of the water, waste out of the water. Water lilies, there's several kinds of native Texas water lilies. Some dragonflies like to lay their eggs, they just drop them in the water. Other dragonflies like to lay them underneath on the bottoms of water lily leaves. And this hornwort will again form dense mats. It's a very important, it will also eat up excess nitrogen and things in the water and provide oxygen in the water. So these are just some of the plants. And around the pond, the more native Texas plants you can put in, the more native insects it will support and attract, and the more active the environment will be. Okay, so another thing that pond stores will probably try to make you very worried about and sell you a lot of chemicals for is algae. It's normal for healthy ponds to have algae. They're just one of the things that live in ponds, and they help soak up nutrients or excess nutrients. They again provide this little strands of algae. Other organisms grow on there. There's a whole universe of tiny creatures that make up the populations on these algal mats. They will tend to be more apparent in the spring when things heat up after the winter. Things have been slowly decaying and breaking down in the water during the winter. And then in the spring, there's all that excess nutrients, and so algae takes advantage of it. It sometimes will be hot up on the surface, sometimes it'll go lower. If there just feels like there's too much and you don't like it, you can just kind of scoop it out, but it really doesn't hurt anything. It's just part of the biodiversity. These ponds are huge biomass producers. I've never seen any minnows or any creature be bothered by the algae. I strongly suggest do not buy chemicals to get rid of it. Okay, again, if your minnows aren't dying, your pond is okay. If you pull up some of the algae and you smell it, or some people pulled things up from the bottom of the pond, they say, oh, it smells awful, something's wrong. That's just how things smell. It's part of the recycling process of decay. Other organisms are using that as food. The pond isn't going to smell. So ponds support native wildlife. It's really very peaceful and connecting feeling to watch wasps and bees come and land on some of the mats of either algae or the hornwort regularly and get water during the hot summer afternoons. The dragonflies, you can see them looking at you. They're actually pretty aggressive defenders of their territory with regards to other dragonflies. The battles they have sometimes are fairly exciting, and they sometimes don't realize you're there. They're so intent. This is a nursery spider or a wolf spider. They can walk kind of on the surface of water, and they often have an egg case they carry with them. So many creatures rely on these sources of water. Amphibians, toads need water to reproduce. The birds will come if you have they like to have a rock or something they can land on that's a source of water. I've seen lizards leap in the air a foot or so and grab a flying dragonfly that's busy fighting some other dragonfly, grab it out of the air and eat it, land in the water, swim to the shore with it in its mouth and eat it. I've actually seen a lizard, which I couldn't believe this, but it actually happens, at the edge of the pond watch and jump in and grab a minnow and haul it out of the water and eat it. There's a lot to see. Okay, so pond maintenance. What do you have to do to maintain these habitat ponds? Really, pretty much nothing, okay? The hornwort can grow pretty dense in the ponds. Usually about once a year, it kind of bothers me. So I carefully, without touching the sides or anything, rake or pull some of it out. I sometimes leave it on the edge of the pond so that if there's any dragonfly larvae or other little creatures, they can crawl back in. That's not really necessary, I guess. But that stuff can be directly applied to your potted plants, to your around as mulch. It's like some of the best, richest mulch you can use as compost or mulch. You don't really have to compost. You can just layer it down on the ground. And these ponds will produce a lot of biomass for that purpose if you want to use it. And then the other thing, but you really only have to, I only ever really get around to doing it maybe once a year. And it's, it's not very hard. Leaves will fall in the pond. They will decompose. If it seems like there's too many leaves, you could rake some of those out. I never really do. So then the other thing you might need to do is add a little water as needed. If it's the summer and it's a very small pond, you may want to top it off every once in a while. I'm going to show an example of a pond I put in. It's really small. And over the summer, maybe I topped it off twice. But again, by having graduated ways for things to get in and out, there can be a good bit of evaporation in between rains, so it's not really a worry. Again, I would be careful about making sure the water's dechlorinated or dechloraminated, especially if it's tadpole, the time when tadpoles are in your pond, because they are really, really, really sensitive to chlorine and can easily be killed. Okay, pitfalls. I'll just go through this quick. Again, don't build your pond on top of city pipes. Don't buy a cheap liner. If you get a good liner, it should last for over 20 years. Make sure you put an underlayer to protect the liner of something. Make sure it's level, the edges are level. Make sure there's safe. Think about safety with regards to children and fencing and having stable paving around the pond. And if you think you need to start feeding the pond creatures, you will cause imbalance in the pond. You should never, ever, ever, ever put food for the fish or anything in the pond. You want them hungry and patrolling, and they will reach balance. This is an example of a pond at West University Elementary School. I was not involved in putting this in, but it's just an example of what you can achieve. This is a small pond I had that's over 20 years old, no problem. It's about 8 feet across. This is a very small pond I just put in that's very active. There's a tadpole eggs that are in it now. It's only about 5 feet by 3 feet. And this is it after it's been put in. And you can see the horse herb down here. This is a larger pond that I designed, and the arrows show those pockets. This is bigger rocks with cement in there, but again, it's a flexible liner, and those where the arrows are going to be where plants, so pickerel weed and Louisiana iris are, and these are some native water lilies. But just to show, this is a very large construction. Nelson's Water Gardens helped put this in, but just to show you what you can do. And that's about it. You know, there's a previous talk I gave. It's on Facebook, the Houston chapter. Local resources, Nelson's Nursery and Water Garden. You can get fish. There's some online resources and my email. Thank you. And if anybody has any questions.
Okay, so the first question is there any way to repair a cut in the pond liner?
Oh, okay, good question. Yes, you mean like if you spring a leak or something?
Yeah, or stab it with a rake or whatever.
Okay, well, I'm always very careful because I certainly don't want to stab it, but these liners are actually really, really tough. When I just recently put that in, I was trying to poke it with a knife. They're really tough, okay? So they're not so fragile as I'm making them out to be. And I think there are ways that you can, you know, glue or reseal them. But worst case is you just drain them and you just get another liner and put it over the liner that's already there and then put the rocks back around it. If it's a smaller pond, that's not that expensive and probably would be the simplest thing. But I think there are ways to glue them. You'd have to talk to someone at a pond store though. I've just never had a problem. These ponds have been in for a long, I've never had a problem with that happening. But
okay.
Sometimes I know people have sealed, like they will take pieces if they want to make a very, very, very huge pond. They can seal strips, big pieces of the pond liner together. So I know there is a way, but.
Is it possible to use an old hot tub or bathtub as your preferred insert, assuming you plug the holes and add levels, or is that more trouble than it's worth?
Well, I just have to say that I don't know what kind of bathtub. Would it rust if it were in the water, or is it a fiberglass bathtub? The other thing is that the ground here expands and contracts. Well, I don't know, you know, like the gumbo soil, the clay soil will. I don't know if it's a rigid too rigid a plastic. I don't know about bathtubs. Would it crack it? That's a consideration. Maybe it wouldn't. Yeah, you certainly could pile some rocks up and so things can get in and out. It's just, I'm not saying you can't use anything else but these pond liners. I'm just saying to think about what could go wrong. I mean, certainly people have let their swimming pools like turn into a pond. That's nothing wrong with that. I don't think a bathtub would be toxic, I'm guessing. I mean, I don't think anything would seep from bathtubs. But yeah, so that's all my thoughts on bathtubs.
Okay.
And a hot tub, I don't even know. There's so many materials for hot tubs. I don't know what kind of hot tub we're talking about, I guess.
Well,
But if it's an inert plastic, if it gives a little bit, probably, if it's not a brittle hard thing, probably it'd be, I don't know.
In gumbo, have you ever been able to do a pond with no liner?
Like just put water in it?
Yeah, dig a hole in gumbo and just go from there.
It will not stay there. It will dissipate. Now there are some kind of sometimes I think I've read about this. You'd have to look this up. When they make really large scale ponds, they sometimes sell some kind of it's some kind of clay that they line them with that really kind of hardens a little bit into a more water impermeable thing. But just regular gumbo, no, these liners aren't that especially the flexible liners aren't that expensive. And if it's a relatively small pond, there's not a lot of labor. It's not too large. A lot of times, if you do the work yourself, you save a lot of money. Yeah, no, digging a hole in clay won't work. It will, especially, yeah, with the heat we have.
What is the smallest pond you recommend? I heard 3 feet deep, but what about length and width?
Okay, so this pond here is a liner I got from Lowe's because I'm renting and I didn't want to put anything too permanent in, and I can rip this out. It's a preformed liner. It's that long, 4.75 feet long, 2.5 feet wide. And at the deepest, right, it's 18 inches. So it's not 2 feet. I would like it deeper, but that's what they had. And so you can see I dug a hole, but I didn't even dig it the whole depth of this. I really just dug a hole to get this bottom part and part of this down in the dirt. And then the dirt I took out for this, I piled around the edges. And I'm not a young person. And I dug the hole in, it didn't take very long. The whole pond got kind of put in one day. And it wasn't too labor intensive or any kind of really heavy work. So this size pond is fully functional. You won't get a ton of dragonflies, but I get dragonflies. Toads lay their eggs in there. This is where I saw lizards fishing. And the liner itself, I think it was either Lowe's or Home Depot, it was like $82. And that was pretty much the cost of the pond because I had old rocks and I had plants from, a previous pond I'd had.
One of the members said that pickerel weed has overtaken her pond. Do you have any recommendations?
Yes, like this pond's very small and you can see where this pointer is. I think that's lizard tail and that's arrowroot. I love pickerel weed, but there's no way I could plant pickerel weed in this pond because it would take over the pond. And it forms dense mats. So you just have to hack it out and you can try. I don't know what the shape of the person's pond is or the size, but that's one reason we formed a little bit of a barrier in that example I gave at the Austin Community Garden, so that you can see when it starts to grow past that line, you can just start, you can keep it trimmed back easier. And it's also in a shallow part of the pond, so you can access it to do that easier too. So that's one reason why we put it where we did and kind of had a demarcation line of rocks. It will overgrow those rocks if you let it though. So yeah, it can be, yeah.
Will plants grow through the liner?
No. Oh, yeah. So you hear about people, worrying about tree roots growing in through the liner. They're feeling there's water there or something. I've never had a problem with that. I've never had a problem with any kind of bushes or trees growing through the liner from the outside. And no, like pickerel reed roots will not grow, push through the liner because all the water is really in the pond for them. So.
A question was, will egret or herons standing in the pond puncture the liner?
No, as I say, I'm sorry, I talk about being so careful, but these things, these liners are really tough. If you go to a pond store and ask them for a little sample, you can see, I mean, I put a sharp knife against a piece of it and pushed. Now, I probably could have punctured it if I really tried, but there was a big indentation where the point of the knife was and it didn't break. So no, an egret will not, landing in your pond will not puncture it. But an egret's probably not going to land in the middle of a dark part of your pond. They're probably going to stand on a rock on the edge and fish from there anyways.
And I assume that adding water from a rain barrel is a good thing?
Yeah, that would be bypass the whole chlorine issue. Now, unless, again, I don't know if it comes off your roof, I guess it would come off your roof. I don't know what the percent of chemicals that might come off of a asphalt roof, but that's something to look at. But I think especially if you're topping off with that water, it's probably fine.
Have you found your pond to attract water moccasins?
I wish. No, not water moccasins. I grew up in Louisiana and we would go hiking in the woods and we would encounter water moccasins and copperheads, and you definitely don't want those in your yard. I have hoped though that my native landscapes and ponds would attract other snakes, beneficial snakes. And I have sadly never seen a snake in my yard. Now, I have lived inside the loop, so that might be part of the issue. But I guess if you live near a bayou, you know, like a natural bayou or ditch where water moccasins live, will they come into your yard? Maybe, yes, maybe, but they might come there whether you have your pond or not. Water moccasins, yeah, I haven't heard of anybody who's had that problem with any pond they've had either, but it depends probably where you live, but yeah.
Another question, almost our last question. Would you situate the pond so it receives runoff from the area around it, or build it up higher to avoid the runoff?
I've tried doing different things. So most of these ponds, they're built up a little higher around the edge. And actually, I don't know if you can tell by this picture, but this side is the kind of approach side, although there's not really much approach. But these rocks are actually angled where the highest edge is toward near the pond, and the lower edge, the furthest edge of the rock is lower. So they're angled so that if you're approaching, you put your foot on that rock, it's angled to hit against the wall kind of, and not slide you or the rock into the pond. So generally in my yards, it's all organic. I don't use chemicals, so I don't really care if water gets runoff in there. If your neighbors use chemicals, you wouldn't want runoff going in your pond. I have tried to do situation. One time I did do a situation where I had one of these flexible liner ponds kind of at the bottom of a larger low point, so that when it rained, water would run in and create a temporary bigger pond, kind of to capture rainwater rather than having it go off the property into the sewer system. But then it would be reabsorbed within a few days and the fish could go back in the pond, or at least most of them. So kind of like a rain garden with one of these habitat ponds at the bottom. And that, you know, worked okay also. But I also knew that it was a big enough piece of land, and what the water flow was that I wasn't going to get runoff and chemicals from like neighbors' yards or something.
Are plants in your ponds always in pots?
No, they're not. It, like this pond, which is very small, I have like 3 pots here. One was the lizard tail, which, you know, is grown, and arrowroot, which I found some seeds growing in a park, and horsetail from another pond. I kept these in pots in this pond because the pond is so small. It would just be a better way to help contain them. Now, eventually the lizard tail has started to come out and grow into the pond. So I took it and brought it to the pond in Austin. But it just still gives you a better definition of controlling where the plant should be. And like the person who asked about pickerel weed overgrowing their pond, you know, if it's in some defined area, whether it's a pot or a walled off area of your pond where you can say, you're going over the boundaries, it makes it easier to control. So, but like the hornwort that grows in the water is obviously not in a pot. Water lilies, when they initially go in the pond, they're in pots. They will crawl out of their pots, and because they're deeper, I don't usually worry about it. They're easier to remove. It kind of depends on the plant, but pickerel weed will grow into very dense mats.
Do we need to be cognizant of distance from structures?
Well, okay, so I would say as far as is the pond going to affect the foundation of your house kind of question, absolutely not, because there's no water going from the pond into the dirt or vice versa. If you build it right under a gutter and water overflows from your roof and the gutter into the pond, assuming that there's not chemical contamination from any asphalt roof tiles or whatever, I guess that wouldn't be a problem, but it won't harm your foundation or anything, if that's the thought.
Okay, well, I think we have made it to the end, and I am so grateful that you came tonight. I think just from the sheer number of people that attended and the number of questions we had, we've all clearly benefited from your time. So thank you so much.
Well, thank you for having me. And these ponds are very important. I hope people will try to, and people can email me if they have questions. I'll be glad to answer them too.